I don't know about you guys, but when I'm making an original ship for Star Trek, I like it to be as lore accurate as possible. So that means picking out a ship class that's going to be appropriate for the era that I'm going to be in, picking out a name for that ship that seems suitable for that class, and also picking out a registry number that is suitable for that class of ship. That last part can be kind of tricky because registry numbers make no sense in Star Trek at all. So what we're going to be doing in this video is going over what little logic there is in terms of registry numbers and trying to figure out, some bits and pieces of what goes into that. And I'll also be going over what I do personally when picking out a registry number for my own ships. Well, the first question to ask is obviously, what is a registry number? And the easiest answer to that is, the NCC 1701 that you see printed on the Enterprise. That's the Enterprise's registry number. Every ship has its own unique number that is unique to that ship, for the most part. There are some exceptions to that rule, but we'll get more into that later. However, we don't really have a canon explanation as to why that number is what it is, or what it means. However, we do have an explanation from Matt Jeffries, the man who designed the original Enterprise. While he didn't really give an in-universe explanation to what NCC means, at least not that I can find, he did state that NCC is meant to be a combination of American aircraft and Soviet aircraft registry numbers. Registry numbers for American civilian aircraft always start with NC, whereas Soviet aircraft use CCCC, so he took elements from both and used them on the Enterprise. His logic being that if we do anything in space, we, the Americans and the Russians, have to do it together. Keep in mind this was the 60s. Jeffries went on to state that the thinking behind the numbers 1701 for the Enterprise were meant to indicate that the ship was the 17th major cruiser design developed by the Federation and was the first in the class, having the serial number of 1. So based on what we know now about Star Trek canon, you could conclude that the Constitution's prototype would have been 1700, and any subsequent Constitution-class ships built after the Enterprise would have had the numbers 1702, 1703, and so on. The problem there is that we already know that this explanation doesn't line up with existing canon, at least not these days. And that's because there are plenty of other Constitution-class ships with registry numbers that start with something other than 17. Cayuga, Constellation, Excalibur, Exeter, Intrepid, New Jersey, Potemkin, and assuming you want to include the Constitution refits, there's also Awani, Eagle, Emden, Endeavour, and Korolev. And that's not even counting the ones marked uncertain by Memory Alpha. And this is just talking about canon sources. Memory Beta has a huge list that is just all over the place. Now, one pattern you can notice pretty quickly when looking at other ships from this era being the mid to late 23rd century, so that covers the first 2 seasons of Discovery, Strange New Worlds, the original series, the animated series, and the first 6 movies. Nearly every ship has a 4-digit number. So the Constitution class, the Miranda class, the Cardenas class, the Shepherd class, the Crossfield class. Pretty much any Federation ship from those shows should have a 4-digit number. But again, there are some exceptions, for some reason. One of the most notable is the Oberth-class USS Grissom, which made its first appearance in Star Trek III The Search for Spock, sporting the registry number NCC 638. That's only 3 digits, which totally doesn't fit with the rest of this era, and yet, there it is. This could have implied that the Oberth-class was meant to be much older than other ships in service at the time, but that doesn't really track because, 1, the ship is clearly sporting a lot of TMP-era design aesthetic, so it certainly looks like it was designed around the 2280s. And there's the fact that the Oberth class continued to be in service well into the 24th century. If it was already an old ship at the point of Star Trek III, I doubt this class would have continued into production that far ahead. Strange New Worlds also did something like this in its first episode featuring the USS Archer, which has the registry number NCC 627. Another 3-digit registry number on a ship that looks like it is contemporary for the rest of the show. This doesn't look like an old ship in comparison to the Enterprise, just a much smaller one. Now, there's also another ship that throws another wrench into all this registry number talk, and that's the USS Kelvin. While the ship did first appear in the 2009 reboot movie, it is important to remember that it is still technically a prime timeline ship, because it's actually the destruction of the ship that creates the diversion of the timelines. The Kelvin had another first for registry numbers because this one had a 4-digit number that started with 0, NCC 0514. Now, this ship being in operation in the early 2230s, it's a largely unexplored time, so you could have the excuse of that's just something they were doing with registry numbers at that point in time, and that this is actually a 3-digit number, NCC 514. But either way, it just means we have yet another weird outlier in terms of registry number logic. Before the Kelvin, the only other time we had seen ships with registry numbers that started with a 0 was in Star Trek Enterprise. Enterprise probably had the smartest and simplest convention for its registry numbers. The letter prefix represented the class of the ship, so NX stood for the NX class starships, and the number was the serial number, so NX-01 was the first of the NX class starships. And we know Columbia was the second NX class ship, so it was the NX-02, and any subsequent NX class ships would keep following that numbering system. Though we also know that this registry convention didn't last because of the USS Franklin. The Franklin's first and only appearance was in Star Trek Beyond, where it was stated that it was the first Earth ship to reach Warp 4. So even though the Franklin was only ever seen in a Kelvin timeline movie, we know this thing actually existed before the divergence of the two timelines. And it actually predates the NX-01 as well, because this was the first Warp 4 ship, whereas the NX-01 was the first Warp 5 ship. Now, the reason I'm bringing this one up is because the Franklin's registry number, a ship that predates the NX-01, its registry number is NX-326. Though the Franklin is a bit of a weird case, because since this was the first ship to hit Warp 4, we can presume that this was one of the ships that was used as a testbed for Earth's warp drive projects. It would later on be used as a Mako ship during the Earth-Romulan War, and then was recommissioned as a ship of exploration after the founding of the Federation. So my assumption is that this registry number was actually lower when the ship was still a testbed for the warp projects, but was changed to the number that we see in Star Trek Beyond after its recommissioning, though the number still feels high to me for this era. Especially when we know that the Starship Essex, which was a Daedalus class that crashed in 2167, only 6 years after the founding of the Federation, had the registry number NCC-173. Now let's move on to the 24th century, because this is where things start to get shaken up again. Because now we're going to be seeing ships with 5-digit registry numbers. We see this on newer ships like the Galaxy, Intrepid, and Defiant class, but also in the 24th century we still see ships that were still active in the 23rd century. Several of which are also now sporting 5-digit numbers, mainly the Excelsior, Miranda, and Oberth class ships. Now, we know the real-world reasoning for this, and that's because the Next Generation blew all their money on building the new Enterprise, but they needed other Starfleet ships to show up in the show. So they grabbed a few of the filming models from the movies and changed up a few of the names and numbers. Now, some more of the weirdness is that some of these older ships are still sporting 4-digit numbers, like the Repulse, the Lantry, and the Stargazer. But later on in the Next Generation, as well as in DS9 and Voyager, you see more Excelsior and Miranda and other older class ships using 5-digit numbers, like the Hood, the Pegasus, or the Saratoga. Cisco's Saratoga, not the one from Star Trek IV, which that's a whole other thing we'll get into later. But again, there are some patterns that you can notice. Older ship classes using 5-digit numbers typically start on the lower end, like starting with numbers like 3 or 4. But newer ships at this point, like the Akira, the Galaxy, and the Nebula, they have numbers that start with around 6 or 7. Now, with this new system, it started a theory among the fanbase that registry numbers were actually sequential to when the ship was constructed. So, say the USS Voyager has just been commissioned, which has the registry number NCC 74656. Based on that theory, the next ship commissioned by Starfleet would be NCC 74657, regardless of its class. But of course, there are a number of examples of why this doesn't work either. For one, there's the USS Nova, the first of the Nova class. We know the Nova's registry number because it appeared on screen in Star Trek Nemesis as part of Starfleet Battlegroup Omega. This was the battlegroup that was supposed to rendezvous with the Enterprise E and help them battle the Scimitar, but the Scimitar managed to ambush the Enterprise in the Basin Rift first. Now, we know of 2 other Nova-class ships that exist in the Prime timeline, the Equinox and the Rhode Island. And even then, you could question the Rhode Island's existence because Admiral Janeway did alter that whole timeline. Anyway, the point that I'm trying to get to is that the USS Nova's registry number is NCC 73515, which is higher than both the Equinox and the Rhode Island. Now, it could be argued that this was a different USS Nova, one that wasn't part of the Nova class, because admittedly we never actually see the USS Nova on screen, or any of the other ships part of Battlegroup Omega, and really the only confirmation we have saying that this was the Nova class prototype is from the 4th edition of the Star Trek Encyclopedia. Technically the books are canon, but I tend to give the encyclopedia a bit more validity considering it is written by Mike and Denise Okuda. Going back to how the sequential theory doesn't really work, let's look at some of the newer ships from the modern shows. The California-class ships from Star Trek Lower Decks are a pretty good example. You've got the Cerritos, whose registry number is NCC 75567, and there are other California-class ships that have numbers close to that, like the Alhambra, the Carlsbad, the Eureka, and the Oakland. But then there are some weird outliers, like the Merced, which is NCC 87075, which is way higher than I would expect for a California class. It also goes in the other direction, because the Rubidoux and the Solvang have numbers that are way too low in my opinion. It's not just Lower Decks. Star Trek Picard has some examples of this as well. The USS Syracuse was a Galaxy-class ship. Its secondary hull was cannibalized and used as part of the reconstruction for the Enterprise D for the sake of the Starfleet Museum. but the Syracuse's registry number can still be seen printed on the nacelle pylons, reading NCC 17744. Though according to a tweet made by Terry Metalis, the Syracuse's registry number is actually supposed to be NCC 1744, which is way too low for a Galaxy class. That's a 4-digit number that I would expect to see on something like a TOS era ship, not a Galaxy class. Picard has another weird example of registry numbers being too low in the Excelsior II. We know for certain the names and numbers of 3 different Excelsior II class ships: the Excelsior, the Eureka, and the Mistral, all of which feature 5-digit registry numbers that start with 420. The first time we see the Excelsior II class is in Season 2 of Star Trek Picard, which takes place in the year 2401. So this is about 20 to 30 years after TNG, DS9, and Voyager. And while it's not explicitly stated that the Excelsior II is a new class of ship, it's certainly presented that way. So if this is meant to be a new generation of Excelsior, why is its registry number lower than some of the older Excelsiors? The Melbourne, the Valley Forge, the Lakota, these are all older Excelsior-class ships from the Next Generation and DS9 that had registry numbers that were higher than the Excelsior IIs. I have no explanation for this. It makes no sense to me, especially when you look at some of the other ships featured in Star Trek Picard. All the Sagan-class ships have numbers that start with 828, and then there's the Star Trek Online ships that were brought into Picard, like the Gagarin and Reliant-class ships, both of which have 5-digit numbers that start with 9. Even the Ilios from Season 3, that was Beverly Crusher's ship. The Ilios was meant to be an older Starfleet ship that had since been relegated into civilian service. We had seen something like that before in the Next Generation, like with the Oberth-class SS Vico. But the Ilios' number is 59019. So if the Excelsior II's numbers are lower than the Ilios, a ship that is so old that it's been relegated to civilian service, does that mean the Excelsior II's are actually older? And if so, if they're that old, why are they still in service? In the end, this is just yet another example of weird inconsistencies with registry numbers. In fact, they're even weirder when you look at the other ships from Star Trek Picard. If you go through and identify the other ship classes that aren't original to Star Trek Picard, you know, the Akiras, the Sovereigns, the Lunas, etc., if you go through the names and registries of those, they seem to have been selected pretty carefully to fit into the era that they were constructed in. If you go through them, nearly all of them have registry numbers that start with 74 or 75, which is pretty consistent with what I would expect to see on a ship constructed in the 2370s and 80s, like the Sovereign class would have been. But at the same time, there doesn't seem to be much logic to the numbers beyond that. Because we know registry numbers aren't determined by the class of ship that they are, like Matt Jeffries originally intended, but at the same time they aren't exactly sequentially numbered either. But that just brings me back to my original point of registry numbers make no sense. And there really is no resolution to that, because it just feels like every time someone comes with a logic behind the numbers, someone else comes along and just pretty much ignores it. Now, let's talk about one weird inconsistency that I've actually developed some headcanon for. The Prometheus, first featured in the Voyager episode Message in a Bottle. This was an advanced prototype designed for long-range tactical missions, which we weirdly never saw fight the Dominion in Deep Space Nine. But something about the Prometheus that not everyone knows is that this thing actually has 2 registry numbers. The one you see printed on the hull is NX 59650, however, the one printed on the Prometheus' dedication plaque says NX 74913. Now, the real explanation for this is that Prometheus was actually supposed to have that second registry number. However, the effects artists at Foundation Imaging were never notified of what Prometheus' registry number was supposed to be, so they just made up their own, which is where the 59650 comes from. Which, if you've been paying attention to this rant, you know that that number is definitely too low for a brand new ship of this era. Now, the headcanon I developed for this is that 59650 is the Prometheus' number while it was still in its prototype phases. Using a lower number makes the ship seem older and therefore less conspicuous, at least on paper. Because the Prometheus was an advanced prototype testing out new experimental tactical systems during a time of war. So Starfleet probably would have taken some security measures to make the ship seem a bit less conspicuous. So my thinking is that putting an older registry number on the Prometheus was a way of calling less attention to the ship. I mean, it clearly didn't work because the Romulans still stole it, but still. This headcanon of mine could also be applied to another ship, the Discovery. When it's introduced in the 3rd episode of Star Trek Discovery, it's stated that the USS Discovery is basically right off the showroom floor, meaning it's a brand new ship. This also means that the Discovery was over a decade newer than the USS Enterprise. So you would think its number would be higher than Enterprise, but really, Discovery's registry number is NCC 1031, which is quite a bit lower than the Enterprise's 1701. However, much like the Prometheus, Discovery was a ship testing a top-secret technology during a time of war, that being the Spore Drive during the Klingon War that followed the Battle of the Binary Stars. So it's possible that the Crossfield-class ships that were made for the sake of designing and developing the Spore Drive, like the Crossfield and the Glenn, were given lower registry numbers so they called less attention to themselves while they tested the top secret technology that was the spore drive. So we've gone over a lot of numbers that ships have used, which admittedly didn't offer a lot of answers. There are some noticeable patterns that can give you an idea of what numbers are suitable for what classes of ships, but at the same time there are quite a number of exceptions to those patterns. Now let's move on to the meaning behind the prefixes for registry numbers. That's, the NCC, the NX, that sort of thing. Because, as you've likely already noticed, not every ship uses the NCC prefix. Now, NCC is the most common seen throughout Star Trek. You see it on most Federation starships. Like I said earlier, there's no in-universe canon explanation for what NCC actually stands for, though the Star Trek Blueprints book that was written and illustrated by Franz Joseph, that's the same guy who did the original Star Trek Tech Manual, his book claims that NCC stands for Naval Construction Contract. Though personally, I never really bought into the idea of NCC standing for Naval Construction Contract just because it doesn't sound very Star Trek to me. Though, to be fair to Franz Joseph, his book was published in 1975. A lot of what we accept as canon these days wasn't a thing back then. But yeah, my point is that NCC is what you see on your typical run-of-the-mill Starfleet ship. But it's not the only registry prefix used by the Federation. I've already talked about a number of ships that use the prefix NX in their registry number. Before Star Trek Enterprise, the NX prefix was always meant to represent experimental or prototype vessels. So any ship that's the first of its class typically has the NX prefix, at least for a time. This was first seen in canon in Star Trek III on the Excelsior. Of course, if you watch Star Trek VI, you know that the Excelsior didn't keep that NX prefix, it having changed from NX 2000 to NCC 2000. And that's because when a ship prototype moves out of the experimental stages and into full production, it gets fully commissioned. So it loses the NX prefix in favor of NCC. So other prototype ships like the Prometheus or the Protostar would eventually lose the NX prefix in favor of the NCC prefix, once they leave the experimental stages and the class goes into full production. That also means that other ships that are confirmed to be the first of their class while also having the NCC prefix, like the starships Galaxy, Nova, and Intrepid, likely had the NX prefix in their early days when they were still experimental ships, but were recommissioned with the NCC prefix when the class entered full production. Now, there is a notable exception to this, the Defiant. Now, obviously the Defiant was the first of her class and an experimental ship at the time it was introduced, but the ship also carried the NX prefix for all 5 seasons it was on Deep Space Nine, even though the Defiant-class starships went into full production as the Dominion War started approaching. And even after the Sao Paulo was rechristened USS Defiant after the original was destroyed, it still kept the NX prefix. And continued to until the ship was retired, because we see it still sporting the NX prefix while it's sitting in the Starfleet Museum. Now, there really is no canon in-universe reason for why the Defiant kept the NX prefix for its entire service. Actually, for its and the Sao Paulo's. But the real-world answer was just that it was a matter of money and time. I'm pretty sure the production crew wanted to change it to NCC at some point in the Defiant's lifetime, but a show like Star Trek reuses a lot of footage of the ship. You know, those shots where the ship's at warp or orbiting a planet. Shots like those got recycled a lot. Changing the Defiant's registry would mean that they would have to reshoot all of those in order to avoid continuity errors. Because, keep in mind, they were still using physical models throughout most of Deep Space Nine's production, so those kind of reshoots cost time and money. This could be the same reason why the Sao Paulo wasn't rechristened Defiant A. Though it could have also been that they just wanted to keep the legacy number thing for the Enterprise alone, but more on that later. Also, don't forget that the NX prefix was used in Star Trek Enterprise, though in that case it didn't represent a prototype ship, but instead was used on the NX class. Not just on the NX-01 Enterprise, but also on the Columbia, and presumably every other subsequent NX-class ship. Like I said earlier, Star Trek Enterprise had Starfleet using a different system, so it doesn't really apply here. There's also a few more obscure registry prefixes. We talked about the Ilios from Star Trek Picard earlier, that uses the prefix NAR in its registry. NAR seems to be used for civilian registries. Like I said, the Ilios used it, it was also used on a civilian-run Oberth class called the SS Vico, and was also seen on the Raven, the ship that Seven of Nine's parents owned when they were assimilated. Star Trek Lower Decks introduced the NA prefix for the Texas class. Because the Texas class ships were fully automated, they were likely given a unique registry in order to reflect that. Star Trek Discovery introduced 2 new prefixes during its second season, NI and NCIA, both of which were used for the Section 31 ships. No, I don't know why they needed 2. Star Trek Enterprise also introduced the ECS prefix. This one's probably the only prefix that we actually know what the letters stand for. Earth Cargo Service, and it was used on cargo ships from Earth that were a part of the Earth Cargo Service. Oddly enough, this was used as the prefix for both the name and registry of cargo ships of those days. Fun fact, Star Trek Align also used the ECS prefix on their model of the Kobayashi Maru. Now, let's talk about legacy registry numbers. I'm not sure if there's a name for this in canon, but you know how they keep adding a letter on every subsequent Enterprise after the original? That's what I'm referring to. After the original one was destroyed, then there was the USS Enterprise NCC-1701A, then a B and a C and so on. We're up to G now thanks to Terry Metalis. For a long time, this was something that Star Trek reserved exclusively for the Enterprise. We had seen other names reused for multiple different ships, like Saratoga. There was the one from Star Trek IV, and then the one from the first episode of DS9. They had the same name, but the second Saratoga had a completely different registry number. We've seen other names reused too, like Excelsior, Stargazer. I'm pretty sure there have been like 4 different Intrepids at this point. This leads to the theory that only ships that have accomplished something really special get legacy numbers. But it was kind of weird that the Enterprise always seemed to be the only ship to have this honor. There were a couple others, but there are huge asterisks on them. The first being the Yamato. In the TNG episode where Silence has leased, Riker identifies the Yamato's registry number as NCC-1305E. However, this is later retconned in the episode Contagion. In the scene where the Yamato explodes, you can clearly see printed on its saucer the registry number NCC-71807. There was also the USS Relativity, NCV-474439G, but this ship was from the far future, the 29th century. We also know that the Relativity was considered a time ship, not a starship, and had a never-before-seen registry prefix, NCV, so it's possible that adding a letter onto the end of the registry for this class of ship could have meant something different. I think this holds further merit too when you get to see the registry numbers from the 31st century ships used by the Federation in Star Trek Discovery Season 3. Because while a lot of those ships are using 6-digit numbers like the Relativity, most of them don't have a legacy registry number. Now, I know someone's going to want to mention this one in the comments, so I'll talk about it now. The Dauntless. This ship had the registry NX-01A. So technically you could call this a legacy number, but it's the legacy for a totally different ship. We know why this one didn't have a lore-accurate registry number, because the Dauntless wasn't actually a Federation ship. It was an alien ship disguised to look like an advanced Federation ship in order to trick the Voyager crew in some guy's crazy revenge plot. I guess the logic behind this ship is that since the Dauntless was presented as a new, highly experimental ship that was unlike anything else that Starfleet had ever built, Starfleet had essentially rebooted their numbering system for their ships. Kind of like when DC Comics reset all of their running stories back to issue 1 for the sake of the New 52 reboot, which went just as well as it did for the Dauntless. Though it could just be that Arcturus was just as confused as I am about registry number logic, or lack thereof. While the older TV shows and movies kept the legacy number thing strictly as a thing for the Enterprise, the books and other licensed Star Trek media were a little looser with this rule. One of the most notable examples of this comes from Peter David's Star Trek New Frontiers series. Initially, this series features the Ambassador-class USS Excalibur, NCC 26517. Over the course of the series, the Excalibur would eventually be destroyed and replaced with a Galaxy-class Excalibur A. Eventually, the newer shows would also lighten up on the only the Enterprise gets a legacy number rule. When Discovery is sent into the 32nd century and finally makes contact with the Federation, not only do you see a number of Starfleet ships sporting legacy numbers, like the Voyager J and the Excalibur M, but when the Discovery is refit with 32nd century technology, it is also recommissioned with the registry number NCC-1031A. So not only is this an example of one of the few Starfleet ships that's not the Enterprise getting a legacy number, but this is also the only example where the ship in question wasn't actually destroyed beforehand, because Discovery hadn't been destroyed, it had just received a refit. A massive refit, but still. This recommissioning was done just so the Federation could present Discovery as a new ship. Because keep in mind that by the 32nd century, time travel is highly illegal at this point following the Temporal Wars. So even though Discovery came from the distant past to the future, the Federation didn't want anyone thinking that they were violating the Temporal Accord somehow. So Discovery only got an A in its registry for the sake of legal trickery. And then there's the Titan A from Star Trek Picard, and this one is kind of a weird one. So a number of times the Titan A is actually called a refit of the original Luna-class Titan, but it really isn't. Calling it a refit was more of a joke than anything else. And that's because in the construction of the Constitution 3, several components from the original Titan were utilized in its construction, mostly from the warp drive. So yeah, Titan A was meant to be a successor to the original Titan. Which is weird that they made that call for Season 3, because in Season 2 they specifically said they didn't want to use a legacy number for the Stargazer. But I'm not going to get into a discussion about the weird or questionable decisions behind Star Trek Picard, because that would end up probably being long enough for its own video. And this one's already proving to be longer than I thought it would be. But yeah, the Titan A was a thing for some reason, and its existence was very much undercut given the fact that it was then rechristened to Enterprise G. Though Star Trek Picard also did somewhat subtly introduce the Voyager B, which is a little weird that they skipped ahead to B, though I'm guessing it's because Prodigy probably already had dibs on Voyager A, and wasn't expecting to be abruptly dropped by some jerk executive at Paramount. So the point that I'm taking way too long to get to is that legacy numbers are reserved for ships that have accomplished something really amazing. The Enterprise is, well, it's the Enterprise. It did something amazing pretty much every week. Voyager survived for 7 years in the Delta Quadrant on its own. That's certainly noteworthy. We don't really know what the Titan accomplished to deserve a legacy number, but this was a ship commanded by Will Riker. Obviously it did something, because that guy's nuts. So you've probably asked yourself a couple times by now, when's he going to tell us how he picks the registry numbers for his own original ships? Yeah, sorry about that. Context seemed important, but holy crap, there was so much context. Anyway, one of the first questions that you should be asking is this original ship that you're making a starship class that's already canon in Star Trek, or is this a new original class? Because if it's the former, then this is actually pretty easy. Just look up other canon ships from that class, look up their registry numbers, and come up with something that kind of fits within those parameters. Just make sure your number isn't lower than that of the original prototype of that class. Then maybe do a search to make sure your number isn't already in use on another ship in Star Trek canon. It's also important to think about what era this ship was constructed in, because, as stated earlier in this video, some classes were in service for a very long time, like the Excelsior Miranda class ships, so the numbers that they've used for these ships have a pretty wide range. So maybe look up some of those individual ships as well to kind of figure out when in the timeline your ship should be. It's also important to keep an eye out for outliers. Some canon ships have registry numbers that make no sense to the rest of their class, like the Syracuse or a few of the California class ships. I would suggest just ignoring them. What I like to do is take the number from a canon ship that's close to what I think fits for the one I'm trying to make, and just change the last two numbers to 47, assuming they weren't higher than 47. Because, 47, classic Star Trek meme number. But sometimes that doesn't fit, so I'll have to change the last two numbers to something else, but you get my idea. Though if it's a 5-digit registry number, I think you can get away with changing the last 3 numbers if you prefer. Now, if this is meant to be an original class of ship, then you're probably going to have to do a bit more searching for numbers, but at the same time, it really just comes back to the question of when in the timeline do you want this ship to have existed? Now, you can look up all this information on Memory Alpha. They're really great at keeping track of a lot of this stuff. If you're finding what's available in canon to be a bit limiting, then you could try Memory Beta. They cover non-canon content, but at the same time, you can probably get some decent inspiration there. Now, if you're wanting to come up with a number for a class of ship that is original to Star Trek Online, Stowe's actually made this pretty easy for you. Memory Alpha obviously doesn't keep track of Star Trek Online ships beyond the few that were made canon in Star Trek Picard. Memory Alpha does to a point, but their coverage on Stowe stuff really isn't always the best. But you can find the registry number for any class of ship in Star Trek Online just by looking it up in the preview of either the C-Store or the ship vendor, or at least any of the Stowe original ships. Some of the previews of canon ships will feature the original prototype name and registry, and some will feature the name and registry of a notable ship of that class, likely from one of the shows or movies. Like if you preview the Miranda class, it'll say USS Reliant, NCC 1864, but if you look up the Miranda Mark I, that one will say USS Miranda, NCC 1800. So once you know the number for the prototype, then you have a reference point. Then all you gotta do is just change the last 2 or 3 numbers. This is how I come up with the numbers for my original Stowe ships. Thanks to the ship previews, we can easily find out that the Odyssey class prototype's registry number was NCC 97000, so when I wanted to make my own original Odyssey class, I just changed the last 2 numbers. Like I said earlier, I like using the number 47 because Star Trek meme number. So my USS Atlantis is NCC 97047. I did the same thing with my Shepard class and my Titan class and a number of others. Now, legacy numbers for original ships, they can be kind of a tricky thing. Personally, I think the fandom overuses legacy numbers a bit much. While I don't think it's something that should be exclusive to the Enterprise, it should be kept for ships with a notable legacy. And at the same time, everyone wants their ship to be special, so a lot of people like to tack on an A or a B to their registry numbers. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't use a legacy number, but at the same time, if you're going to use one, you better have a good backstory for it. Because we've seen plenty of times in Star Trek that names get reused, but they often get a new number. So yeah, that is the nonsense that is registry numbers for Federation ships in Star Trek. Like I said, there was some logic to these in the beginning, but then that just kind of got stepped on by someone else's thinking behind them, or just got outright ignored in certain occasions. Anyway, I hope some of you found this to be helpful in coming up with registry numbers for your own original Star Trek ships. Or at the very least, I hope you thought the lore discussion was interesting. Either way, let me know what you thought down in the comments down below, and while you're down there, be sure to like and subscribe and hit that bell for notifications. If you'd like to further support the channel, you can hit that join button to become a member, or hit the super thanks button, or, what's the third one? Oh, the merch store. The link to the merch store in the video's description. If you're ever shopping on the Epic Game Store, be sure to use my content creator code, STU1701. Doesn't cost you anything extra, but it does help me out. That is Epic content creator code, STU1701. Either way, though, thank you so much for watching. My name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time.